Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom podcast. I've got Richard Easton here, and he is the co-author of GPS Declassified, From Smart Bombs to Smartphones, and he's been studying GPS for 20 years. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So GPS is crazy. I know from our tweets conversations that GPS was invented and it's so fundamental to our world. I know so little about it, but I imagine I'll be understanding a lot more about it after this interview. Global positioning system, is that right?
Yes.
And so what is it? There's something about triangulation, right? Like me being here, triangulating something, and then there's a satellite involved. Is that it?
Well, it's got satellites in 12-hour orbits.
Okay.
They're in 6 constellations, each symmetrically 60 degrees apart. There's a minimum of 24. Typically these days, the U.S. system has 31. There's legacy issues why they don't go beyond 32, so 2 to the 5th. And the history of the program is subject of much controversy. My father, Roger Easton, started working on his time navigation system in 1964, thinking that atomic clocks would advance enough that it would make a GPS type of system feasible. The Air Force was working on their project 621B. In 1973, they set up a joint program office headed up by the Air Force. The GPS program was approved that December, but it's a subject of much controversy over when civilian use arose, who did what. Everyone invented it, but for the inventors. I mean, you go to Twitter X, and I can get people angry on many different issues.
On GPS?
Say that's not correct.
Yeah. So it's wild because there's the meta question about history here, which is really interesting because it's like, we've got history. History in general is controversial. Like, Charlemagne, I'm sure there's people who will get angry about you for Charlemagne. It's not a mainstream anger, but modern history is even more controversial because there's so many questions about what's happening. And I've been getting onto the thread very recently about how secrecy itself muddies the water, right? Because we have institutions, those institutions are collapsing. Those institutions also have a lot of secrecy, so they don't allow us to understand a lot of things, which, during enlightened government times seems pretty important. But I think we're all coming onto the same page that we don't live in an enlightened government, and secrecy are some interesting paths that we could go down. So what have you learned about history in terms of trying to understand recent events, given the secrecy thing?
Secrecy is not such a big issue with respect to GPS, because contrary to what some people may say, it was always an open system. I mean, it was announced, Phil Klass, who wrote a lot about UFOs in the 60s, 70s, 80s, was a senior editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. And he wrote a column in August 1973 about the situation. It was not yet called GPS. It got that name sometime. It had the real wonderful name, Defense Navigation Satellite System. So you can well understand why they replaced it by GPS. But in August, there were 2 major issues. The Navy wanted mid-Earth orbits. The Air Force wanted geo and high-inclined orbits. The Navy wanted to put the precise atomic clocks in the satellites, autonomous satellites. The Air Force wanted them to be repeater satellites. So if you have a system-based regional constellation based on geo, they're always going to be in sight of the ground station. So you don't have to have the accurate clocks in the satellites. On the other hand, you jam or destroy the ground station, you take the system down. Whereas the Navy system in mid-Earth orbits, you knock one ground station out, it'll degrade the system, but the satellites will just go on to the next ground station. So it's less vulnerable, but it also requires very accurate clocks. And two of my father's colleagues, Pete Wilhelm and Lee Hammerstrom, are still with us. I talk regularly with them. And they say when my dad proposed the GPS type system in 64, Pete told me he just turned 90. He said his thought was the clocks need to be improved by several orders of magnitude. That won't happen in his lifetime. So they were very skeptical about it. And he said that to my dad, and my dad said, "Oh, it's an engineering problem." But he also pushed improvement in the clocks. So part of innovation is seeing where you need advances to make your system feasible and pushing that.
Yeah, interesting. That's super interesting. There's a thread of decentralized innovation outside of the large big science type of thing that we have now. I'm also within the centralized big science. I'm very interested in innovation as well, but there's that juxtaposition that we could go to. But before that, I want to zero in on the clocks. So, and it sounds like the atomic clocks were really important.
Yes.
And clocks did get better, and that's why GPS is everywhere. Is that right?
Yes. The atomic clock was developed after World War II, and in April of 1964, my father was talking with Dr. Arnold Shostak. You may know his son Seth works on SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, his father worked for the Navy, and they were talking about the hydrogen maser, which for the time was a very advanced atomic clock developed in 1960. And my dad said it made a passive ranging type of system, which is how GPS works, feasible. So again, if you know where the satellites are, and you have at least 24 satellites in orbit, unless you're in a deep canyon or in certain places in Manhattan, you'll have at least 4 satellites in sight. So with 4, if you know the position of the satellite, when it sent the signal to you, your receiver doesn't have an atomic clock, but it's got a clock. And with 4 satellites in sight, it can compute its 3-dimensional position and the time offset. So that's why you have basically three aspects of GPS. You have the ground stations, you have the satellites, and you have the receiver. And the original receivers weighed a lot, 150 pounds or something like that. So some people claim that DARPA invented GPS. What DARPA did is it supported transit, the first NavSat, developed prior to GPS. And then starting in 1983, they funded miniaturization of the receivers. So DARPA played an important role, but it did not invent GPS.
Okay, this is made a lot clearer. So there's a ground station, there's the satellite, and the receiver, and the phone is now the receiver for all this stuff, right?
Yes. And of course, you have the mapping. You not only have a phone, but you have Google Maps or whatever Waze, whatever system you're using has maps of the Earth around where you are. And of course, the more advanced ones now have live traffic updates. So they tell you,
not only you, but everyone else.
Yeah. Now, one problem is, I was living north of Chicago and was doing a consulting project in Madison, Wisconsin. And I'd leave Madison about 2:00 on Friday afternoon, and it would tell me the highways were the best way to get to my home. Well, the highways at 2:00 were. At 4:00, they would be a lot tougher. So I'd take a more scenic route that would avoid most of the highways. So, I don't know if any of the mapping now have AI to say what's the best route, given that you're starting now and traffic's going to get a lot heavier in 2 hours. So
So, well, there's a new company. You had mentioned Waze. Waze is interesting because Waze is a Israeli tech startup that got bought by Google that did really good. I remember driving around India, and it was really helpful in driving around India back in 2013. There's a new company called Niantic Spatial, and you may have heard of Niantic before. Niantic is the ones who developed Pokemon Go,
Okay.
which probably also their Pokemon Go is also very related to mapping and the
Hmm.
GPS. I'm sure they use GPS. And so they're starting a new AI focused mapping company. And it's so interesting because maps, the CIA symbol is a compass. And, you know, it's like maps are so essential to knowing where we are and where we're going. And then there's maps of like, you know, Google Maps, but there's also maps of frameworks and understanding and and we're entering the information age, or we've already entered the information age. I think it's now non-debatable that we are in the information age. Um, so the mapping is really interesting. How much of the phone is GPS? Like if you were, because the phone is a smartphone, it does all these crazy things. What percentage of that is a GPS based? Like
I would
it's not even
guess
the
it's
right.
I would
Yeah.
guess it's pretty small by now. I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay.
um, yeah, it's just a tiny little in our
Miniaturization.
in our book, and of course, I author. I got to even someone who was in no danger of becoming a bestseller. Got to advertise the book, or
Yeah.
the writers' uh, colony will drag me away. But we have pictures of how much the GPS receivers became smaller and smaller, and the chips became smaller and smaller. So now, I don't know, in an iPhone, it might be 1/200th. I mean, of course, they always talk about the landing computers on Apollo. You know how much computing power they had compared to your cheap iPhone is today,
Yeah.
and but
How
it's
much?
by now it's a small aspect, though obviously very important aspect of your smartphone.
How much of those landing gear relied on GPS? How foundational? No, that was early.
Oh,
You said
that
yeah,
was that
yeah,
was way
yeah.
no. They
Oh,
had
interesting.
they had I think three computer modes depending as they descended towards the surface of the moon. And of course, if you listen to Apollo 11, there'll be some references. I think you're wrong. When they separated
Mm,
the lunar module from the command module, I think there was a little bit of air left, and they got a little acceleration at that, which caused them to land about 4 miles long. So,
mm.
you know, uh,
4 miles long from where they originally planned.
correct. And I think it was a little more hazardous area. Um, Armstrong, they were freaking out. He was doing maneuvers that they had not done in all their simulations, where he saw a boulder field and he flew the lunar module
Whoa.
basically level above the moon for a certain distance, and I think they might have had 13 seconds of fuel left when he landed. Now they could probably land from 30 feet without fuel, and of course they were close to what they called the dead zone, where
Of
an abort is probably more dangerous than landing, because you get close enough, your upper stage may not have time to fire before you crash into the moon. But we're here to talk
yeah,
about
yeah,
GPS.
well, wide open where we can go wherever we
Yeah,
want to go. But
yeah.
the 1960s they had the three different computer modes, giant computers, and
Well,
then GPS was yeah.
this was the tiny computer aboard the lunar module that you hear, like mode 64, approach maybe to 5,000 feet. I don't have the exact. And then
Yeah.
the second one might take you within 2,000 feet, and then the lowest one to actually
Oh.
land.
Oh.
And of course, Armstrong took over with the
Hmm.
assistance of the computer to when he saw they were going to land in a dangerous area. So it's said that the Soviets were most impressed by Apollo 12, the follow up, because
Okay.
there they landed within a quarter mile of the Surveyor 3. So the Soviets said, "Oh my goodness, the Americans, you know, they between Apollo 11 and 12, they'd learned a lot about landing the lunar module. They no longer had the problem with the extra bump, and they were able to land pinpoint, you know, to this
Wherever they
data.
want.
Yeah, yeah.
And that gets us back to GPS, because I imagine GPS, all the things you just talked about were made much easier by GPS for landing, for aircraft, for
Oh,
avionics.
without a doubt. The one subject of much controversy is the year 1973, with
Mm.
the first head of the Joint Program Office, Brad Parkinson, saying he and 10 to 12 other people invented it at the Lonely
Mm.
Halls meeting over Labor Day 1973. We can set that aside. But GPS, the program was approved that December. They launched the first 4 test satellites in 1978
Mm.
and 2 more in 1980. I think they were 10 out of 11 on the test satellites. And Congress, in its infinite wisdom in the 1970s, when they approved the space shuttle, they said all government satellites have to be launched on the shuttle. So the Block 2
Oh.
operational satellites were supposed to go on the shuttle, which was really stupid. I mean, shuttle goes 200, 250 miles up. GPS satellites are in 12-hour orbits, about 12,000 miles up. So at any rate, when Challenger blew up in January of 86, the Air Force decided, okay, this is not a good idea. And they developed, I think it was the Delta II, to launch the initial operational satellites, which began in 1989. When the Gulf War broke out, the GPS constellation was not complete, but it was complete enough, and they did some tweaks that it was very important in Gulf War One. Both for timing, the initial helicopter strikes to wipe out Iraqi radar.
Yeah.
The time was based on GPS,
Uh,
but also when there was a terrible sandstorm, the coalition attacking forces were actually had an advantage from the sandstorm because they knew where they were, and the Iraqis had much less idea where they were because the coalition forces had GPS. So, normally for an attacker, bad weather is bad for you, but with
Interesting.
GPS, they knew, where they were very precisely. So it was actually an advantage.
So that makes me think you have some important understanding, given your historical knowledge about the future of warfare, because I saw this crazy visualization of where it's headed, and it was pretty interesting, and it involved a lot of the things we're talking about. But let's go. Let's keep on going with the history. So we have satellites. We have a whole constellation of satellites that allow extreme fine detail over where any object is on the world, in the planet, and that was already happening in the 1989 or for the government, and then it took
Yeah.
another 10 to 15 years for that to go in. Well, yeah, let's talk about the 90s. What was happening with GPS in the 90s leading up to the
Well,
eventual smartphone?
let's go back a little bit. Okay, so TI was producing a civilian receiver, the 4100, in 1981.
Cool.
So people who say that civilian GPS started with a Korean airliner being shot down in September 1st, 1983, that's not true. Civilian use was always envisioned. And there was, we have on our website, July 1974 project management plan,
What's
which
the
talks
website?
about gpsdeclassified.com. You go under resources and you'll see a bunch of early documents. And one is July 1974, which talks about a signal in the clear for both the civilian and military user. So now, when the Block 2 operational satellites were launched, the Air Force and the military in general was worried about terrorists using GPS. So they distorted the civilian signal using what they called selective availability. which made its accuracy about 100 yards rather than a couple of yards. And they turned it on, I think, in May of 1990. And then Saddam invaded Kuwait. And about 85% of the receivers used in Gulf War I were civilian. So they turned selective availability off for the Gulf War, figuring that the Iraqis probably would not have GPS receivers. And then they turned it back on in 1991 after the Gulf War ended. So
wait, sorry. I have to. I was opening the website and taking a note to share the website later. And you basically, the Iraqis had civilian GPS, which the government then turned on.
No. What happened is, in May of, and I may be a month or two off, but I think it's May of 1990, they turned on selective availability, which distorted the civilian signal. Then Saddam, on I think it was August 2nd, invades Kuwait. They send quickly a large number of troops to Iraq, to Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry. And the military did not envision a war suddenly breaking out. Military procurement can be kind of slow. And there was still a fair bit of skepticism about GPS. So I think of the coalition forces, about 850 receivers were military receivers, and about 85%, maybe 4,500 were either soldiers buying GPS or their parents buying it and sending it to them.
Wow.
And they figured probably Saddam doesn't have any receivers, period. So we'll turn off selective availability to make the civilian receivers almost as accurate as the military ones.
So what you're saying is there is already dual use of these GPS things.
Yes.
And there's a lot of Americans who had bought these receivers to do what? What were they doing for the civilian purposes?
In 1990, surveyors certainly, they were using the TI 4100. Before the constellation is complete, you just put your surveying instrument down and you wait for the satellites to go overhead. I think when Saddam invaded Kuwait, we had 14 GPS satellites. And by the time Gulf War I started, we had 17. So it wasn't, a complete 3D system, but it still had useful applications, particularly like things like surveying.
So GPS is definitely the sort of number one consumer satellite technology, which created the market later, which we have now going with SpaceX, where they're sending up tons of satellites. The original reason that we wanted satellites up there was for GPS, or were there other uses as well?
Well, you had communication satellites, you had weather satellites, you had lots. And another thing that I've found in the last 2 years, I mentioned Pete Wilhelm and Lee Hammerstrom. They were working both on GPS and on secret ELINT satellites. So at the Naval Research Lab. So the first ELINT satellite, Grab-1, was launched in June of 1960, and it was a secondary payload to a transit satellite. So one thing Pete said is they had a lot of money for transit. The Navy was very interested. It was a two-dimensional system available maybe once an hour, so good for Polaris submarines. And so there was a lot of money for transit, and they had Grab. You're talking about secrecy. They had Grab as a secret component within a scientific satellite called SOLRAD. So Pete said he was working on transmitters for SOLRAD, and suddenly they took him aside and said, oh, by the way, there's a secret element to this satellite called Grab, which is going to detect Soviet radars. And he said Francis Gary Powers had just been shot down. So Eisenhower told them,
wow,
I want to know in advance every time you're going to turn this thing on over the Soviet Union, and you have to have specific approval from me before you do it.
So and I believe you're talking about the U.S. high altitude fighter who got shot down in the U.S. and the Soviets realized that they were being
Yeah, the
spied.
U-2,
Yeah, you too.
Francis Gary
Yeah,
Powers got shot down on May Day,
yeah.
1960, ruined a potential summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev.
Oh, interesting.
And so Eisenhower was, very nervous about approving those. And of course, Powers got shot down. So,
And that's probably a huge part of the reason that Eisenhower, not only, I found out recently that Truman was also aware of it, but Eisenhower was very aware of the military-industrial complex as of course. And so he probably saw that and was just like, okay, well, what's going on? Like this giant big science thing that invented the nuclear bomb is now doing things in the government that are creating political crisis for me. Is that an accurate representation? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he worried about, his famous speech right before he left the presidency in 1961. He warned about it. But anyway, that's one example. And then you go to 1967, and you talk about the challenge of getting money. My father had started a timation program in 64, and he wanted to launch satellites to test it. Is a passive ranging, the time difference I talked about, can you actually real world use that to give an accurate position of a receiver? So they had a follow on to a grab called Poppy that was pairs of satellites. It would allow them to much more finely determine where the Soviet radars were. Because Grab was just a single satellite. You can detect frequencies, but you don't know where they are.
Oh.
And you talked about mapping of the world. It's said that the Soviets gave deceptive maps to Westerners. Wouldn't be exactly where they were. And but at any rate, so they had poppies, a lot of money for poppies, and almost no money for my dad's timation. But timation 1 was a secondary payload on a poppy satellite in 67, and timation 2 similarly a secondary to a poppy in 69. But some of the same people were working on both the unclassified NavSats and the classified ELINTs. And Pete Wilhelm came up with a way of using obsolete Atlas Fs to launch the last 2 timation satellites, and that method was also used to launch the Block 1 test GPS satellites. So you have a lot of exchange between the secret world and the public world.
And that leads us up to today, which is just like the private-public partnerships and the Church Committee in the 1970s. Church Committee in the 1970s, for my listeners, is where, is right after Nixon, right after JFK. There's a 1968 was a popular revolution, not only in the U.S., but all over the West. And just started to demand for accountability from the intelligence agencies and also the FBI. And so they came up with the Church Committee and did a full investigation into everything. And then afterwards, the intelligence agencies a little bit just shifted their behavior to get out of scrutiny. And then you had so the public-private partnerships, which have become very popular. But the other side to this is that I'm not a straight up conspiracy theorist. I'm trying to be a conspiracy factist. And this leads us to the secrecy part, because none of us know so I'm imagining from the title of your book, GPS Declassified, that you've gone in various times and found these declassified things. Can you talk more about that process? That seems like an interesting process, particularly Nixon. I want to go get Nixon's tapes. I want to go figure out what Nixon was saying, basically.
Well, a lot of it is simply finding documents and finding the right people to interview. Yeah. When I started getting interested in GPS 20 years ago, yes, there were a lot of documents and a lot of people had done a lot of work. But for something as important as GPS is, it was very poorly understood. And I think it may be more misunderstood now. You have all sorts of people giving credit for it who are did phenomenal work, but everyone knows what GPS is, and different
It's almost like the
people.
internet. It's almost like the
Oh,
internet in terms of like a crazy new technology that a bunch of people take credit for, but nobody really knows.
I mean, Lee Hammerstrom. I was on a program on the space show, which uh, is a very useful program for finding information about space related.
Oh, okay.
I was on one with Lee and Pete on June 1st, and Lee said, "Yeah, with the internet, you really have to be skeptical."
Al Gore.
And I mean, I've found just in the last year, I got a document which changes my. I mentioned the Lonely Halls claim. It changes my view of Lonely Halls, but Brad Parkinson's account should be treated with extreme skepticism. So there's in some ways I'm fortunate in that I knew a lot of the people involved in the development of GPS.
Yeah, interesting.
And the average author writing today, I mean, with the internet, you have a lot of freelance authors that are just struggling to get by, and they get a commission to write something, and they look to see what's out there, and there are 75 articles saying that the Korean airliner led to civilian GPS. So I'm going to write the 76th, where, like I said, TI was selling a civilian receiver 2 years before that. So the Reagan administration said, in response to the Korean airliner being shot down, when GPS is fully operational in 1988, we'll give it freely to commercial airliners to avoid another disaster like this. But that was actually repeating what was already government policy. That what people misread that to say Reagan declassified GPS. No, they just repeated what was already official government policy.
Wait, but there is some sort of declassification event related to GPS that you've taken advantage of? Not really.
I mean, there's certainly lots of information, and some of the original documents, had to be declassified. I mean, the precision of GPS. The Pentagon in 1968 set up criteria for a successor to transit, one of which it be accurate within 50 feet. The 50 feet aspect of it was classified. And there are aspects of the encrypted military signal that are classified. On the other hand, one of my dad's colleagues, Ron Beard, told a funny story. He said he was in a meeting with the Air Force and NSA, and the Air Force was talking about how secure the encrypted signal was, and the NSA people said, "Oh, we break those type of codes online."
Yeah. Oh man, it's so interesting where to go, because there's the declassified angle, and I've been looking into the regulations. I'm just down in Argentina, so I'm creating an AI community and group and potentially a business down here. And so now I'm like, there's like opportunities to discuss with various entities, including government entities. And so I looked into the actual regulations in the United States, and there's a whole bunch. There's like CFICUS or something like that. And all of them, what it's specific about is things like what you just said of 50 feet. It's the numbers, it's the specifications, it's all these little content pieces that are like the giving away the actual information. And it's a question I've had. I'm a knowledge management professional, so I think about these types of things about knowledge management. And in my last company was very transparent, but there was also things about, as you grow as a company, there's some things you want to keep, because particularly once you grow as a company, then you start getting competitive intelligence from other companies. And so it's just like and at the same time I do a podcast. And I don't want to reveal anything, not for secrecy's sake, but for privacy's sake, of like respecting privacy from the various people who I talk to in my daily life, and the sources, the journalistic integrity, all these different things. And it's so interesting to me, as we enter the information age, it feels like those little details are going to come out, like everything's coming out. Here, I would love to ask you, it feels like in the information age, there's nowhere to hide. So having something to hide becomes a problem. Whereas the past 1,000 years, you could hide things, but you can't hide things anymore.
Well, you had the Soviet KGB official Gordievsky, who got disillusioned with the Soviet Union and
What's his name?
became a mole. Gordievsky became a mole for the British. I don't know if it's MI5 or MI6, but he was giving them tremendous amount of information. In fact, in 1983, he may have helped save the world from nuclear catastrophe because that was a very fraught year. You had Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire in March. Korean airliner is shot down on September 1st. About 3 weeks later, Soviet satellites detect what they think is 5 ICBMs launched by the U.S. Actually, they were misinterpreting the sun for launches. And the Soviet colonel said, if the Americans attack us, they're not going to launch 5 ICBMs.
They're going to launch the whole thing. Yeah.
He was skeptical.
Yeah.
And then we had a war game called Able Archer that November, which the Soviets thought was cover for a first strike. And so they had various things to look at to see if the nasty Westerners are preparing a first strike. One is if there are lights in government buildings late at night, lights on, and they didn't realize the cleaning staff comes late at night to clean it up.
Yeah.
So anyway, Gordievsky was able to tell his higher ups. Well, he was able to tell the British, the Soviets think you're preparing a first strike. The British told the Americans. So Reagan toned down the rhetoric.
Oh, interesting.
He basically warned the West. These folks are you had all those movies from the 1960s like Fail Safe or even Dr. Strangelove, where you get nuclear war by accident.
Yeah.
But anyway, Gordievsky, there was an American spy, who started telling the Soviets a lot of things, and they figured out Gordievsky was probably the mole. And so they called him back to Moscow. And the British said to him, if you want to defect now, you've done so much for us. We'll give you, you'll be set for life. And he said, no, I think I can handle this. And then he was realizing, okay, they're on to me. And he had a signal to send, go through a park with a certain bag that he sent to the British saying, exfiltrate me.
Wow.
So they had a plan where two couples were leaving Moscow. They sent out signals saying that one of them was very sick and needed to be treated in Finland. And in about 8 miles from the border, they picked up Gordievsky, put him in the trunk, and exfiltrated him across the border. But of course, if you have modern spy cameras everywhere,
none of that would have been possible.
Even in the authoritarian Soviet Union of the 1985 or 1986, he could disappear. Yeah. And it would be much tougher to do that today.
Yeah, and we're already there. We're already any major urban city in any country in the world, I would probably put it at that point now. Maybe East Timor is the only place, but that's not a really urban place, or Jakarta or something like that. Maybe in Jakarta there aren't. But even in Jakarta, I think there's probably a bunch of cameras everywhere, and those cameras are getting more and more hooked up into centralized databases. The Great Firewall of China was just breached a few weeks ago, and so we actually got a lot of information that was hacked about how they're selling the technology to places like Pakistan. Pakistan can, I was just looking at it this morning, can simultaneously surveil 4 million people on their phones. So it's just like that's all happening. And then on the other end, it feels like a lot of things are promising to take away centralization of power, including the fact that now I can go find out about all those things. So me as the civilian can go learn about all these different things, and there's nowhere for them to hide either. There's nowhere for me to hide, and there's no way for them to hide either.
Well, and of course, in the Vietnam War, America had an overwhelming advantage in air power.
Yeah, interesting.
And the North Vietnamese responded by grab them by the belts. In other words, they would try to be so close to the Americans that you couldn't use air power. And similarly, people learn about GPS and they jam or spoof it, or they
countermeasures.
Or if you're fighting a guerrilla war against the Americans, you don't fight one-on-one. You do hit and run and disappear into the civilian populations. Similar to the Nazis in 1943 had basically smart bombs to attack Allied ships off Sicily. And the Western people soon learned how to jam it. So, all these amazing technology, there's
always countermeasures.
Oh yeah. None of them last forever.
So let's talk about that. So, and we were at the 90s before we went on many tangents, which I highly approve of. So the 90s, we have the Gulf War. Drones started probably about 12, 13 years ago. I imagine GPS is really important for the drone thing. What happened between the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of drone in the war on terror in the 90s?
Okay, so the 1990s, the military put back on selective availability. By the same token, groups like the Department of Transportation, FAA, wanted to use GPS for civilian aircraft, what Reagan's administration had announced in 1983. And they needed better accuracy than selective availability would give them. So what you do is you put land beacons with known positions, sending out signals that basically tell the GPS device how much selective availability is distorting it. So they allow it offset. So I say it's a good government program. The DoD is degrading the signal, and the DOT is telling you how to get around it.
Whoa, oh, that's interesting.
So over time, GPS, the selective availability was becoming unsustainable. And they turned it off on May 1st, 2000, and that led to an explosion of civilian applications, including things like geocaching. I think that started maybe May 2nd. So
what is geocaching again?
Geocaching is where, for people with too much time on their hands, where they tell you where to find certain medallions, and then they people, I found I took a picture of this medallion which was left on 102 Dead Skunk Road. But more seriously, all the civilian applications, agriculture, trucking, just took off in the 2000s after they turned selective availability off.
Okay, that's really interesting. I love the DOT versus the DoD. Sounds like a great...
I joked on another podcast that I discovered the perpetual motion machine, the DOD versus the DoD.
Interesting. Okay, and so then in the 2000s, this happens. And we can talk about space now, because it sounds like from this whole interview I'm getting that the GPS allowed for people to use satellites to do just positioning. But then I watched this great documentary on the rise of all the space companies, and went into one specific one from Silicon Valley, which went up there and mapped everything. And they had civilian use for mapping the things like Haiti after the earthquake and all these different, civilian purposes. And so they're sending up actual imaging satellites. And then you got Umbra satellites is another one that does a lot of imaging. So with the imaging, it's essentially we're creating like a panopticon around the world where everything
Yes.
can be seen.
And GPS is a P&T system, positioning, navigation, and timing. Don't forget about the timing. Wall Street timing has a lot of applications that also comes from GPS. And yes, the certainly the danger of the government, and of course now with AI, is the video you're seeing real, or is it? It's.
And I've got a great interview if any of the listeners want to go back and watch it, where I interviewed a team of people. You can easily find it on YouTube because they're all in masks, crazy masks, where they're actually developing technology that can essentially validate as a countermeasure to what you just said about deepfakes, proof of liveness. So we've got the whole world kind of like turning into this thing. And then you mentioned LLMs, which is a very good point because the LLMs allow us to do the same thing with information, but they're publicly available to all consumers. And now we can build our own software. I don't have to rely on a cloud supporter like Oracle, which has really, really strong ties with the government. I can go build my own server now, all things that were totally unavailable to me 2 years ago and now relatively available to me. So we're entering such a world where both the technology is getting better and better. I'm actually optimistic in the 5 to 10 year timeline that governments won't be so crazy just because they won't be able to do all the, like, yes, they can surveil everything, but they can't censor everything. Now it feels like censorship is not possible.
Well, and the LLMs, a lot of people operate under the illusion that everything important is available on the net.
Yes.
And or also, how do you evaluate?
Yeah.
I mean, 2 years ago on Twitter, September, 2 great anniversaries that weren't anniversaries.
Yeah.
So September 2023, all over Twitter, 40th anniversary of the shooting down that led to civilian GPS. And then 50th anniversary of Lonely Hall. They gave up the weekend and they gave you GPS. I used to live in Chicago, and there was a documentary, The Lonely Halls Meeting, released in 2018. And to me, I wrote a review of it for a weekly free magazine called The Space Review. It was like the documentary was like voting in Chicago. The errors were early and often. I mean, I was detecting about 1 error a minute. I mean, it started out, just to give you an example. It started out by saying a true statement that Bill Geyer and George Weifenbach, who later developed the first NavSat transit, they were at the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. And October 4th, Sputnik 1 is launched. That's on a Friday. The following Monday, they're detecting the signal, and they decide by looking at the Doppler effect, they can determine where the satellite is. So Doppler, train is heading towards you. The train whistle frequency is raised. Heading away from you, it's lowered. So you can use the Doppler from the signal from Sputnik 1 to estimate its orbit. So they said, and then 6 months later, their boss said, "Can you turn that into a NavSat?" And the documentary says the first time someone thought of using a satellite for navigation was Geyer and Waffenbach. But Edward Everett Hale wrote a short story called The Brick Moon in 1869 about using satellites for navigation.
Oh, cool.
So, and Arthur C. Clarke, in a 1956 letter, talked about using satellites for navigation. My father co-wrote the proposal for Vanguard in April of 1955, which talked about using satellites for navigation. So, oh God, this document. We have 3 minutes of introduction, and the first statement is wrong.
So this gets into the question we can end with the last 10 minutes or so, is that basically there's 2 things I want to talk about. There's one, the rise of big science and how that allowed for innovation, starting with the government realizing they needed to make alliances with big research institutions in order to do this really hard, really expensive research and create all this marvelous technology that we have now today. But then connected to that, I want to talk about the future of innovation, because it feels like to me that the only thing the government of the United States wants to innovate on is AI, and in some ways might be a sort of a red herring for all the things we could. Maybe they're probably thinking about robotics as well, and maybe I'm just misunderstanding the American energy right now. But it feels like we're going back to gentleman science. Maybe it's just my cope, but I think we're headed back for gentleman science, where you have people of means who are eccentric, who are now also have this access to this crazy technology of AI and compute, and soon robots, and all the effects that's going to have on the wet labs and all these different things. So from your understanding of big science and the innovation, do you see a decentralized version of big science, or do you think I'm off on this thesis?
Well, this may seem like another rabbit hole, but with COVID,
yeah,
my day job is as an actuary, so I'm evaluating risk. And with COVID, I soon became aware that what government people were telling me didn't make any sense. And I you had certain people like the Prime Minister of New Zealand saying, we'll become your sole source of information. And I'm thinking, gee, I grew up during the Cold War. Isn't that what the Soviets were?
Yeah.
And we're supposedly a republic,
How did it happen?
Government cannot be my only source of information.
Yeah.
They have, some of them, some of the CDC people may be profiting from the products they're approving. So there's conflict of interest. And I think there is potential, with the greater information, that smaller groups of people can come up with huge advances.
Because
the big lumbering behemoths may be too slow and bureaucratic to do it.
Because that's also how big science rose, right? Like it was in the 1950s and 1960s, small groups of people that just had a government that was sort of more enlightened and was able to funnel them the resources that needed. Is that an accurate representation of how GPS evolved?
Well, you had some people like John Foster, who was the head of government research, DDRE, in the Pentagon.
Cool.
From 1964 to 1973. My dad got his ear, and he had enough power to push decisions. So it can be decentralized as long as, if you're Leonardo da Vinci in 1500, you can do all the plans for a helicopter you want. You need the technology, you need the idea, and you need the funding.
Yeah.
And the question is, can a small group of people, get enough people to support them? I mean, there were other alternatives to GPS. There was a consortium of GE, NASA, and the airlines that were working on a system like that. But then you had a jump in the fuel prices in 1970, and the airlines pulled out. Whereas the DoD, had enough funding long-term to support GPS. Even though the system was approved in 73, they got the 24 satellite in sight in orbit 20 years later. So, when you have those type of lags, you need somebody who can write big checks to keep you going.
Well, it's either write big checks or the cost of everything goes way down, and it feels like it's not about the big checks. Or it might still be about the big checks. The problem with the big checks is that the whole monetary situation is totally screwed. If
you're SpaceX, and you've significantly lowered the cost to orbit, you're still trying to figure out, okay, we now have the Falcon 9s, which can launch very rapidly, rapid reusability. How do we create the demand? And Starlink was the way of creating the demand. I was recently reading a book about it, and Elon said, "Gee, most companies building Starlink type systems have gone bankrupt. So
Yeah.
how do we avoid that?"
Wow.
So yeah, you either have people who can write big checks, or like you said, you can drop the cost so it's not as expensive, or you can, at interim points, make enough money that you can sustain the longer term.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What do you think, last 5 minutes, what do you think is the future of the university system in the United States as it relates to innovation? Are they still going to play a role?
When they get rid of the 75th dean of blah, 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 I mean, the bureaucratic bloat
Yeah.
over the past 50 years has been outrageous.
Yeah.
And so I think they're going to be a lot of failed universities.
Yeah.
And my wife had a friend who worked for deans of a major university, and she said, some of the spending that they engaged in was really crazy.
Yeah.
So we, the days of the 80,000 tuition, room and board, I think they're going to go.
Yeah, it's almost like we need a new university. There was a great write-up of how Olin College was a great system that went bankrupt due to that administration thing, and just somebody needs to create a bunch of Olin colleges, which is really focused on practical things. And maybe it's the small liberal arts. Maybe as this change happens in societies, all those small liberal arts ones that maintain fiscal discipline can turn into research universities, because the the novelty of academia really, it's like the novelty mixed with the lack of financial attention because of the crazy inflation and money printing, that connected with these universities to essentially create these bureaucratic giant monsters that do a lot of things all because of credentials, and have an incentive to create novel research. But that novel research basically just is a lot of BS, because they're just trying to create novel, complicated things that don't actually mean anything practically. And I wonder if there's I think, like, maybe going back to the 1500s to what a university used to be, but this research university of big science seems really important. So there's something there, I think, as well.
Yeah, I took non-credit classes at University of Chicago called the basic program. And I had an undergraduate degree, but the basic program did a much better job of teaching me to think.
Yes, interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And people can check out gpsdeclassified.com. And I got the book there as well. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good questions.